What would you do if you walked into a boardroom with a proper invitation in hand, only to be mistaken for the coffee girl? Not because you were late, not because you did anything wrong, just because you were a black woman wearing a worn-out button-up shirt and no one knew your name. This isn't a movie. This isn't a scripted drama. This is a true story about Janelle Thomas, the woman who was dismissed in the very headquarters of the company where she owns 42% of the shares. She didn't get angry. She didn't walk out. Instead, she nodded, picked up the tray of coffee, and quietly memorized every face, every word, every glance. And just 3 hours later, in that same room, the very people who ordered her around had to stand up and call her CEO. But where did that journey begin? In East Side Detroit, where no one talked about dreams of success, only survival. From a little girl raised by a single mom who worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on. From long nights spent studying at the public library. From Harvard. From being labeled a diversity hire. And from a single letter that changed everything. The 67-story glass tower of Vantage Core gleamed gold in the early morning light. A monument of steel and ambition rising from the heart of Chicago. The ground floor buzzed with ironed suits free of creases, the rhythmic tapping of high heels on marble floors, green-lit key cards flashing, and conference calls echoing from Bluetooth earpieces. Amid that crowd, Janelle Thomas stepped inside, unnoticed. No one looked up. No one asked. She wore a light gray blazer, black slacks, and slightly scuffed loafers. Her hair was neatly tied back. No makeup. Just a slim folder in her hand. The only clue she wasn't there to make a delivery or clean was an embossed Vantage Core invitation clipped to her folder. It read, "Invitation to observe Monday morning strategy meeting, conference room, 44th floor, guest code JT-0117. Beneath it was the digital signature of interim CEO Victor Salinger. She pressed 44 in the elevator. A young white security manager glanced at her through the mirrored ceiling panel without greeting her. When the doors opened, a woman in a beige suit blinked in surprise. "Excuse me, are you here for janitorial inspection?" Janelle simply held up the invitation card, saying nothing. No reaction, no emotion. She walked on. The frosted glass doors to the conference room opened. A long oval table stretched more than 30 feet through the center of the room, surrounded by 18 black leather chairs. Walnut-paneled walls, soft lighting filtering from modern chandeliers, floating like crystal snowflakes. Janelle entered before the meeting began. A few people were checking the projector, others typing on their phones. No one looked at her for more than 3 seconds, except for one man at the head of the table who glanced up, his eyes sharp, ruthless, but not entirely void of humanity. "Black coffee, no cream, and be quick about it," he said, not moving, not looking twice. That was Derek Wolfe, Vice President of Strategy, veteran of 17 M&A deals, and responsible for the firing of 3 senior VPs within 2 years. He didn't know who Janelle was. To him, she was logistics staff, or worse, a temporary coffee runner with no defined title. Janelle stood still for a moment. Her grip tightened on the folder. Her breath caught in her chest. Her eyes narrowed, not in anger, but as if recording his face. She nodded wordlessly. No one noticed. No one cared. They went on discussing Southeast Asian market share, unfinished slides, and things that would soon become irrelevant. She turned and walked out. The hallway on the 44th floor was quiet, carpeted in charcoal gray. She headed for the pantry, where internal staff went to pour water, grab coffee, or sigh over quarterly financial pressures. On the way, a mid-level manager nodded at her like to a fellow facilities worker. She didn't react. Still holding the tray, her eyes focused on the coffee machine ahead. The smell of Arabica mingled with vanilla in the still air. She set the tray down, selected Colombian roast, exactly what men like Derek Wolfe usually drank. Bold, bitter, no sweetness. The machine hissed. Coffee streamed into the cup. Janelle watched the dark liquid, as if staring at the invisible glass ceiling that divided those who sat and those who served in rooms like this. 10 years ago, she had washed dishes at an Italian restaurant in South Detroit. That night, her mother, Monica Thomas, had just been fired for dozing off mid-shift at a private hospital. It was her third dismissal in 6 months. Her mother told her, "Don't be like me. Don't let anyone define your worth by your apron or your hours." But now, as the coffee filled the cup under the dim machine light, she didn't think of her mother as a tired woman who fell asleep. She thought of her as the one who taught her how to walk through humiliation without losing herself. The coffee tray was ready. Janelle returned, her steps slow but steady. She pushed open the glass conference room door with her shoulder. Not hard, not soft. Derek Wolfe didn't look up. Neither did anyone else. She placed the coffee cup directly in front of him. No spill, no tremble, not a single drop wasted. He kept his eyes glued to the report. No word of thanks. But Janelle didn't need thanks. Because in her mind, a door had opened. And behind that door, a storm was gathering. The meeting began. Interim CEO Victor Salinger entered with a thick binder. He gave Janelle a brief nod. She didn't sit at the table. She stood at the back of the room, where the light was dimmer, where service staff usually waited until summoned. But no one knew she wasn't here just to observe. She wasn't a guest. She wasn't a coffee server. She was here to start a war. Not for fame, but for a promise she had written at 16. One day Mom will sit in the front row, and I will be the one stepping up, not to ask for a job, but to lead. In the palm of her right hand, the imprint of the folder she had gripped all the way on the morning train was still faintly visible. No one could see it, but every heartbeat, every step, every misunderstood word, every judgmental glance from head to toe was fermenting inside her. She didn't need to get angry. She just needed to wait for the right moment. 9:15 a.m. The first slide appeared. Derek Wolfe began his presentation. His words were polished as always. Innovation-driven, expansion leverage, client visibility realignment. Janelle knew those phrases well. They were the same buzzwords that had stalled the company for 3 straight quarters. She knew it because she had authored a similar proposal back when she was a freelance advisor for a startup collective 2 years ago. But they never let her pitch it because client-facing materials need a certain polish. Certain polish was code for, you don't look the part to stand in front of clients. She stood there, coffee cooling on the tray, eyes fixed on Derek, following every word. She took no notes, raised no objections, because in just a few more days, she wouldn't have to speak. Today's silence was the backdrop for the shockwave no one in that room could predict. The silence of a woman the entire company had casually categorized as a face that doesn't matter. During the 15-minute break, a new assistant arrived with pastries and water. The young woman in a navy blue uniform fumbled slightly with the tray. Janelle stepped over to help her place the jug without spilling it. The girl mumbled, "Thanks. Are you new here?" Janelle smiled without answering. But in the girl's eyes, there was something Janelle had longed for at age 22. A look that was real, unfiltered, free of assumptions. She nodded. You could say that. When the meeting resumed, no one mentioned Janelle's presence. To them, she had faded into the space like the coffee machine. Summoned when needed, forgotten when done. But to Janelle, this was the first stage of a larger plan, deeper and sharper than any growth strategy Derek Wolfe had ever drafted. By the time the meeting ended near noon, Victor Salinger looked at her again. His gaze no longer that of a CEO surveying a guest. It was more like a man confirming her presence, as if fulfilling a private instruction from someone no longer alive. The co-founder of this company had intentionally erased from its history pages. As the conference room door closed behind Janelle, her footsteps echoed in the hallway like a ticking clock. Each step was calm, unshaken, because she knew the battle had already begun the moment Derek Wolfe asked for black coffee, unaware he was ordering it from the future owner of the entire company. And she, Janelle Thomas, would be the one to make him taste the bitterest coffee of his life. East Side Detroit doesn't appear on tourist postcards. It has no tree-lined boulevards, no crowded indie cafes with lines out the door, and no playground safe enough for kids to bike through on a Saturday afternoon. People there don't talk about careers. They talk about how to survive. Winter comes like a clamp, squeezing the life out of faded red brick houses. Summer scorches the concrete front yards. And in a neighborhood tangled with power lines, where random gunshots don't make anyone flinch anymore, a little girl named Janelle Thomas grew up, with eyes too intelligent for her age, and a heart that refused to accept the fate the rest of her neighborhood had long resigned to. Her mother, Monica Thomas, was a small woman with calloused hands and a posture that always leaned forward, as if carrying the weight of the world. Monica once dreamed of becoming a nurse, but when Janelle's father, Eugene Thomas, died of a heart attack when Janelle was only 4, those dreams vanished like unpaid bills. By day, Monica worked as a janitor at Maple Grove Nursing Home. Her duties were to mop floors, change bed sheets, and clean rooms of those who had passed away. At night, she changed uniforms and worked at a Chinese restaurant at the end of Gratiot Street, standing behind a dish pit until 1 a.m. Her hands were always swollen and red. Her clothes always smelled of antiseptic mixed with old grease. Yet Janelle never once heard her complain. Monica only said, "Don't let the uniform define you. They may not see you, but you must always see yourself." Those words etched deeper into Janelle's memory than any paragraph she ever studied. She didn't have time for backyard games or weekend picnics. After school, when the neighbor kids played basketball on a cracked court, she slipped into the community library, a peeling cement building filled with books. There she discovered something magical. Numbers could tell stories. A battered old book titled The Basics of Investing by an unknown author became her first teacher in finance. She learned to distinguish stocks from bonds before she could drive. She understood that compound interest was the real magic in life, not fairy tales. She devoured everything she could find, from Warren Buffett to Barbara Corcoran. But she didn't just read, she experimented. Every month, Monica gave her $5 for snacks. Janelle didn't spend it, she saved it. By the time she was 13, she opened her first savings account at a local credit union with $92. 3 years later, thanks to extra cash earned from weekend packing gigs, that amount had grown to over $600. To others, it wasn't much, but to Janelle, it was proof that she could change the numbers. And if she could change the numbers, she could change her life. Not everyone appreciated her difference. In high school, Janelle was the only black student in her AP economics class. Teachers often complimented her by saying they were surprised how well she did, while classmates mockingly called her walking dictionary. One time when she raised a point that the opportunity cost of unpaid family labor is not accurately reflected in GDP, the entire class burst out laughing. A boy shouted, "You're late for dish duty, Professor." That day, she came home earlier than usual. She skipped dinner, said nothing. Her mother noticed and simply said, "You don't have to be like anyone else. You just have to be yourself. And remember, the louder they laugh, the more afraid they are of what they don't understand." Her mother's words landed on her chest like a gentle latch. Not painful, but enough to make her stand taller. She kept studying, joined the debate club, enrolled in the city's youth entrepreneurship program, and attended a summer camp run by the Obama Foundation for Promising Students. There, for the first time, she stood on a stage to speak about finance in minority communities. With a microphone, spotlight, and an audience that genuinely listened. She ended her presentation with, "Finance is not just for the wealthy. It's a life skill, and everyone, no matter where they're from, deserves to know how to use it." The summer she turned 17, a day before her birthday, she came home to find her mother sitting silently by the window, holding a yellow envelope. It was a foreclosure notice. Monica didn't have enough for the month's mortgage. If they didn't pay within 14 days, the house would be reclaimed. Janelle said nothing. That night, after her mother had fallen asleep, she pulled out an old diary, one she had kept since age 10, and wrote a line in red ink. "I promise one day you'll never have to worry about another bill. I will walk into a building where they stand to greet you, not because I'm great, but because you gave your life so I could have that chance." That promise, handwritten with a trembling hand on a worn page, became the invisible charter for everything she did after. When she applied to Harvard, people called her delusional. "No one from around here has ever gone there. They don't take people like us. Where will you get the money?" But she didn't just apply. She submitted an essay titled "Financial Illiteracy as a Form of Social Injustice." She included her personal investment tracking spreadsheet from the past 3 years, built on an old Excel file but full of logic and structure. One winter afternoon, while Monica was hanging her old coat to dry, Janelle came running, holding a thick envelope. Her mother had never screamed that loud in her life. They hugged each other on the cracked tile floor, crying not because of Harvard, but because that narrow path had finally led somewhere. 3 months later, Janelle boarded a bus to Massachusetts with a small suitcase, a few old books, and a photo of her mother smiling with the acceptance letter in hand. From the window, she watched the old houses of East Side fade into the distance. But in her heart, East Side Detroit didn't disappear. It just stepped back, like a tattoo beneath the skin, unseen but permanent. It was the reminder of where she came from, who raised her, and why she wasn't allowed to fall, not even once. Autumn in Cambridge looked like nowhere Janelle had ever lived. Maple leaves blazed like fire, covering the old brick courtyards. Cobblestone paths led into brownstone buildings, older than her family's entire known history. When Janelle Thomas first stepped into Harvard Yard with her worn backpack and chin held high, she had no idea what awaited her. She only knew she had arrived at a place once whispered about like sacred ground, a place where the American dream supposedly came true. But in the first few weeks, that dream began to unravel in ways no admissions brochure had ever warned her about. In the lecture hall for Economics 10, a foundational course for first-year students, Janelle chose a middle seat and listened intently. She answered the professor's question about free markets thoroughly, with supporting arguments. But after class, a male student approached her, smirking. "Wow, impressive. You're definitely not just here on affirmative action." He walked away like he had just given a compliment. Janelle stood still, saying nothing. It wasn't the last time. She quickly learned that not everyone saw her as a high-achieving student. To some classmates, especially those from elite prep schools in New York or Boston, she was just the diversity admit, the token, or worse, the poor girl from the hood who got lucky. The professors never said it aloud. But sometimes the way they skimmed past her when calling on students, or the pause they took when grading her papers, made it clear that doubt wasn't always verbal. Once, in a seminar session, she presented a diagram she had drawn herself, outlining global supply chain models. The teaching fellow nodded and said, "Unexpectedly well-structured." There it was again, unexpectedly. She started to realize that no matter how well she performed, everything she did came with an invisible asterisk of surprise. Widener Library became her second home. She went there every night after class, always choosing the same table near the third-floor window, overlooking the central yard lit in golden hues. When her roommates went to fraternity parties, she read. When her class had outdoor mixers, she built financial models on her laptop. With every keystroke, she repeated to herself, "I don't need recognition, as long as the results can't be denied." She didn't argue when dismissed. She didn't react when mocked for wearing discount store shoes. But in silence, she drafted her survival strategy. Fail no class, never rank second. 4 years passed like a long campaign. She joined a microfinance research group focused on East Africa, was invited to write for the undergraduate economics journal, and became one of only 3 students selected for a summer internship at a boutique investment fund in Manhattan. Each time she achieved something, a part of her felt relief, but another part felt angry. Why did she have to work 3 times as hard to be recognized half as much? The bias followed her into job interviews after graduation. At a financial consulting firm in Boston, a manager glanced at her resume and asked, "Tell me about a time when you felt out of place." She smiled and answered, "Now." At another firm, when she fluently explained a social impact investment strategy, the interviewer tilted their head and asked, "Where did you really learn to talk like that?" She didn't know how to convince them that eloquence wasn't reserved for kids raised in oak-paneled homes. At an interview with a prestigious investment firm in Chicago, Vantage Corp, the recruiter looked at her credentials and said, "Impressive, but to be honest, you seem better suited for a supporting analyst role. You'd be a great fit supporting someone more client-facing." The sentence hit like a soft mallet to the head, not painful at first, but echoing long after. They didn't see her as someone who could lead. They saw her as someone who could support. Janelle graduated in the top 3% of her class, with a near-perfect GPA, recommendation letters from 3 professors, and a published research thesis in an academic journal. But back in her small rented room in Chicago, when she opened her inbox, she saw that real opportunities still went to those with fewer achievements, but the right background. No matter what she did, in their eyes, she remained the assistant potential, someone intelligent but not polished enough to be at the center. But Janelle didn't break. She only grew quieter, more observant, more strategic. She knew the truth wasn't in how people judged you when you entered the room, but in how you made them unable to ignore you when you left. And so, she kept working, kept learning, kept building herself into a closed system. Low profile but unshakable, precise, and ready to unlock. The soft click of the glass conference room door closing behind Janelle felt like an invisible slash, severing the last thread tying her to the outside world. In her hands, the silver tray trembled slightly from the heat of the freshly brewed coffee, but her grip was steady. Her steps across the carpeted floor stretched out like a stream of thoughts she was deliberately containing, pressing back like a flood behind a dam. As she returned to the table, Derek Wolfe didn't look up. His fingers slid across his tablet screen, as if the entire world consisted only of the next presentation slide he was about to deliver. Janelle set the tray down, slowly, precisely, without a sound. The black coffee, no sugar, was placed exactly where he liked it, right side next to his printed documents and his silver fountain pen engraved with his name. A few glances flicked her way. Not kind glances. They were the looks of people who had already placed her in the box labeled, "Here to serve." A middle-aged woman to Wolf's left, senior director of HR, glanced over and curled her lip, as if observing a staff member performing routine duties. A young analytics director raised an eyebrow and mouthed, "Nice tray." Someone else stifled a laugh. These glances didn't anger Janelle. They only confirmed what she had known from the moment she walked in. To them, she didn't exist as someone with a name. She stepped back, stood tall, eyes fixed on the screen though her mind was no longer in the room. In her head, the image of a man appeared. Tall, prematurely gray, deep voice yet warm, always keeping a respectful distance as if aware his presence wasn't allowed. That man was Jerome Ackerman. Once dubbed the original brain behind Vantage Core, he had withdrawn from executive leadership and disappeared from public view after an internal dispute in 2004. The company's official history claimed he transferred all remaining shares to the managing shareholders, but the truth was never revealed, and he never truly left. 10 days ago, Janelle received a letter, a cream-colored envelope sent from the law firm of Braddock and Lane, signed by Anthony Braddock, Jerome Ackerman's personal attorney. The letter read, "Per clause 8.3 of Testament Document Number 22G, signed on June 9, 2022, Mr. Jerome Ackerman bequeaths his remaining 42% ownership stake in Vantage Core to Ms. Janelle Thomas, his sole legal and rightful heir." Beneath it was a scanned signature in blue ink, calm, delicate, like a final breath. She read the letter 3 times. Each time the emotion changed. The first was shock, the second, outrage, and the third, a quiet that had no name. Jerome Ackerman was her father, a truth she had suspected since age 19, but had never confirmed. Her mother, Monica, had never stated it directly. Only once, during a fever, did she murmur, "Your father was the one who missed out, but he never forgot you." She never mentioned it again. But Janelle kept an old, torn photograph of a man in a suit standing in a backyard she had never recognized. Now everything was clear. He hadn't forgotten. He had waited for the right moment, and that moment was today. This senior board meeting was the opening act in the transfer of shares, a transition planned and sealed 2 years prior. Jerome knew that when he passed, someone would object to leaving nearly half the company to a black woman with no appropriate background. So he designed a path, one where she would first appear invisible, then slowly come into focus, until the truth could no longer be ignored. And this was Act 1 of that plan, serving coffee to the man who had once driven her father out of the executive board. Derek Wolfe took a sip. No reaction. The bitterness was familiar, unsweetened, unfazed. He set the cup down and continued his presentation on capital integration strategy and scalability of digital services. Janelle remained still, silent. She knew that if she spoke now, she'd be seen only as the coffee girl with an opinion. But just a few days from now, when the shareholder documents were made public, when the board would be forced to vote to ratify the transfer, None of those glances could pretend not to know who she really was. She thought of her mother, at home, hands trembling when Janelle handed her the letter days ago. Monica had cried, not for the money, but because her daughter was about to step into a room she'd never been allowed to dream of. Janelle took a deep breath, held her stance. Her eyes stayed on the slides, but her ears caught every keyboard tap, every sigh, every snide whisper from the corners of the room. A CFO murmured, "She's still here." Another chimed in, "Maybe she's waiting for the dishes." She didn't turn. And then, in a moment bordering on absurdity, she smiled. Not out of joy, but because she understood that this silence, this misjudgment, this condescension would be the foundation for the reversal to come. Like in a stage play where the most overlooked character turns out to be the true owner of the entire set. When the meeting ended, people stood up one by one, some stretching, some rushing to check phones. Wolf stood, said nothing to her, walked past without a glance. The woman beside him glanced at the coffee tray, then turned away as if even the air wasn't worth her attention. Janelle bowed her head to lift the tray, turned to leave, but her eyes no longer lowered. Inside, she was rewriting history, step by step, breath by breath. And in a few days, when her name appeared on the controlling shareholder list, when the board was forced to convene an emergency session to address the press, when the investment world realized that the woman they had treated as staff owned nearly half of Vantage Core, then every one of those looks from today would be swallowed back in silence. And Derek Wolf, who had just finished the coffee she prepared, would be the first to taste the bitterness of a mistake that could never be undone. 3 days before the meeting, on a rain-soaked afternoon in Chicago, Janelle Thomas stood in front of the old mailbox outside her second-floor apartment on West Belmont Street and noticed something different. It wasn't a bill. It wasn't junk mail. It wasn't the cheap envelopes that usually showed up at the start of every month. This one was thick, cream-colored, with embossed edges. The recipient's name was printed in classic serif typeface, Miss Janelle Thomas. In the top left corner, a raised logo read, Franks and Halberd, LLP. She had never heard of the firm, but what made her heartbeat falter was the small line below it. Private, legal delivery, open immediately. She brought the envelope into her small kitchen, where canned goods sat neatly stacked and the ceiling fan spun with a tired clack. She placed the envelope on the table beside an unfinished file folder and stared at it as if it had dropped from another world. She didn't open it right away. She poured herself a glass of water, leaned against the fridge, eyes never leaving the envelope. Finally, she sat down, reached for a letter opener, and carefully slit the edge, like performing spiritual surgery. Inside was a formal, multi-page letter, folded with precision, accompanied by a notarized legal document. The letter began with solemn language. "Dear Ms. Thomas, my name is Elliot Franks, legal counsel to Mr. Jerome Ackerman, co-founder of Vantage Core. I write to you under the legal authorization outlined in sealed document number JAA 42 regarding the transfer of personal assets and corporate shares." Janelle paused. Her heart began to pound harder. She kept reading, each word cutting into a part of her memory that had never fully taken shape. Before his passing, Mr. Ackerman left behind a final directive, instructing me to contact you at a specifically designated time, 3 days before the executive board meeting at Vantage Core headquarters, to inform you that you are the sole legal heir to the remaining ownership stake held by Mr. Ackerman in the company, amounting to a 42% controlling interest. The letters blurred before her eyes. She blinked, not from tears, but because her brain simply refused to process the information. Jerome Ackerman. She knew that name, not just because he had helped build one of Chicago's most powerful financial empires, not just because he was once on the cover of Forbes in 2003, but because her mother, Monica, had uttered that name once, and only once, on a stormy night when Janelle turned 19. That night, Monica had sipped half a glass of cheap wine to celebrate her full-ride scholarship to Harvard. In a moment of emotion, she said, "You know, there are some people who don't dare step into the light, but they still watch you from the shadows." Jerome was one of them. Janelle had asked again, but Monica only shook her head. "Don't ask me about that. It's the past. No one needs to know." But now she knew. All the pieces she had once ignored began to align. The old photo in the shoebox, the man standing next to her mother, always with his face cut off. That time Monica fell silent when hearing Jerome Ackerman had stepped down from the board, even though she never paid attention to business news. The vague remark, "You're smart like your father." Now it all shone with clarity, like sunlight breaking through a dusty window. She turned to the second page. The attorney's voice continued with cold precision. Mr. Ackerman chose to keep the blood relation confidential for the sake of personal safety and shareholder stability throughout his life. However, following a critical health event earlier this year, he amended his will, naming you as his sole heir. Per clause 8.3 of the sealed directive, the full transfer of shares is to be disclosed to the board at the scheduled meeting on the 17th, precisely at 10 a.m. In the executive conference room, 44th floor. Janelle glanced at the clock. It was 3:47 p.m., 3 days before the day that would upend the history of Vantage Corps. She held the documents in her hand, frozen. Everything she once believed to be the summit, getting into Harvard, graduating top of her class, years of quiet struggle against bias, suddenly seemed like just the prelude. The father she had never met had planted a time bomb in the middle of Vantage Corps' executive structure, and the detonator was now in her hand. She quietly closed the folder, tucked it into a waterproof sleeve, and sat in stillness in her silent kitchen. No sound except for the ticking of the wall clock. She thought of her mother. She thought of every floor scrubbed, every cheap can of chicken soup, every hug that wasn't long enough because the night shift came too soon. And she thought of her father, a man who chose to stand outside her life, yet left behind a legacy like a final act of redemption. She didn't forgive him, but she accepted it. Because now, on her shoulders, she carried more than her own story. She carried a past that had been denied, a system built on flawed assumptions, and a future waiting to be rewritten. The 44th floor of Vantage Corps headquarters radiated a kind of courteous silence, where the sound of high heels echoed like the turning of million-dollar contracts. Janelle stepped out of the boardroom carrying an empty coffee tray. A few glances skimmed past her, but no eye lingered for more than 2 seconds. No one wondered who she was. No one thought to ask. A graying man wearing glasses and a name tag reading L. Graham walked up to her. No introduction, no greeting. He simply handed over a thick packet of documents like a silent command. He said briskly, "Take this down to the print room on 12. Have them make 4 sets, double-sided, red binders. Bring it back here within 30 minutes. No thank you. No eye contact. Just another order handed to a shadow standing in exactly the spot they assumed she belonged." Janelle nodded, turned wordlessly, and walked off. No protest, no confusion, no hesitation. But in her mind she recorded his name, the way he stressed red binders, the angle of his lean, and how not a single soul in the adjacent offices said a word or raised an eyebrow at the way she was treated like a utility worker. Back in the boardroom, carrying the black coffee, Derek Wolfe didn't look up. He continued his conversation with another executive about last quarter's profit margins, as if no one had entered the room. Janelle quietly set the tray down without making a sound. Around her, a few pairs of eyes flicked in her direction, one curled in a smirk, another raised in quiet contempt, and one simply shook his head, as if pitying someone lost in a place they didn't belong. Not a single person in that room knew that Janelle was holding 42% ownership of the company. She was merely observing how a legacy power structure behaved when it didn't realize it was being watched. During the meeting, she was given 3 more errands. First, to retrieve printed reports from the lower floor. Second, to fetch investment fund maps. And finally, to deliver a USB with confidential files to the interim CEO's office. No one asked if she was busy. No one asked her name. They simply saw a silent black woman in plain clothes who didn't push back, so they cast her in the background role they assumed would never change. While delivering documents to the executive suite, she pressed the elevator button but was stopped by a tall blonde woman in a deep red blazer, eyes sharp with authority. "You're not allowed on this floor," the woman said with a polite but frosty tone. "The executive level isn't for support staff. Perhaps you're lost?" Janelle looked directly into her eyes and said nothing, then slowly stepped back. That was Margaret Ellison, Senior Director of Human Resources. The way she judged, The cadence in her voice and the certainty in her stance made it clear she had long practiced sorting human beings within the first 2 seconds of seeing them. Janelle returned to the lower level, sent the files through an intermediary as instructed. No defiance, no gesture of resistance. But in her mind, Margaret's face had been carefully filed, not for revenge, but for inclusion in the post-restructuring personnel assessment. That entire afternoon, she was tasked with checking water supplies, testing pens for the afternoon strategy session, and verifying the catering order for next week's summit. No one in the strategic division suspected she wasn't a temp or an intern. They simply saw a quiet black woman, and that was enough to define her rank in the invisible hierarchy of the firm. No one asked her name. No one read the blank name tag she had deliberately left off, per her lawyer's advice. No one realized she was Jerome Ackerman's heir. By the time she left the office, light rain had begun falling. In the dim hallway lights, her footsteps echoed alone. No one said goodbye. No one walked her out. No one remembered she'd been there at all today, but they would tomorrow. In a room lit by cold white lights where slides projected soft graphs and fading financial diagrams, Derek Wolfe was wrapping up his presentation with a 3-year financial forecast. The screen filled with smooth curves, muted colors representing profit, costs, and return on investment. His voice was flat, lifeless, but no one dared interrupt. The other executives, though visibly tired, nodded as if agreement were the only acceptable currency of loyalty. A few young associates scribbled notes, though clearly none of them understood the substance of Wolfe's proposal. Coffee cups had gone cold. Marker caps had been twisted off and cracked. The air was thick with a kind of boredom wrapped in a professional shell. Janelle stood at the end of the table, both hands resting lightly on a stack of documents she hadn't yet distributed. She had been there for over an hour, sent to fetch water, take notes, pick up fallen pages. No one had asked her opinion. In their eyes, she was still a nameless assistant, or worse, an outsider someone had brought in like a decorative fixture. But in her mind, every passing minute had been carefully measured. She knew that every delay had a purpose, and the right moment never needed permission. When Derek Wolfe ended with, "I think there's nothing more to say. This plan is the best we've got," he punched each word like nails into a door he was ready to slam shut. No applause, no objections. The silence in the room was the silence of routine, from people too accustomed to nodding within the system. And just then, a voice cut through, not loud but clear, like a blade slicing through velvet. "I disagree with this plan." Every head turned at once, a conditioned reflex. Janelle didn't need to raise her voice. She simply stood straight, eyes fixed on Wolfe. She took 2 steps forward, slow but steady, as if even the conference room floor were holding its breath in anticipation. Wolfe frowned. "Excuse me, who gave you permission?" "I hold 42% of this company's shares," Janelle said, presenting a crisp document stamped with a legal seal. "And I have the right to speak. The plan you just proposed is not only outdated, it risks compromising the one core value we can't afford to lose: people." A second of stillness, and then the room froze. Some executives blinked. Others leaned back as if the oxygen had just been pulled from the air. Wolfe flushed. His hand trembled slightly, though he tried to keep his voice level. "You must be joking. I don't recall anyone named—" "Janelle Thomas," she said, not needing to shout. "Daughter of Jerome Ackerman, the co-founder whose name you allowed to vanish from this company's history. He left all his shares to me, and I've waited long enough." A few board members flipped through documents, scrambling to verify. Others glanced at each other, searching for signs that this was some elaborate prank. But Janelle stepped toward the presentation console, inserted a USB. A slide appeared, not a graph, but a photograph. Jerome Ackerman, in 1984, shaking hands with Ethan Bell, the other co-founder of Vantage Core. In the corner, a handwritten note in blue ink, "For my daughter, whose voice will one day change the room." Janelle began to speak, not in dense financial jargon, but through stories of disconnect between leadership and staff, of a culture where young employees felt invisible, of a 14% spike in customer service resignations over 6 months. Not due to salary, but because no one was listening. She proposed a plan: restructure the internal feedback system, form a multi-generational advisory council to balance voices across ranks, and implement an open review model for long-term strategy. No one interrupted. Wolf had turned pale. She closed with one sentence. I'm not here to dismantle. I'm here to rebuild what you've forgotten. That this company was founded on two hands, a dream, and one truth. That no one should be forgotten in the house their father helped build. No one moved. The chief financial officer, a 40-something Asian woman, was the first to speak. I'd like to review her proposal in detail. Then a second voice, then a third. Wolf didn't speak again. He stared into his cold coffee. In his mind, perhaps, there was still anger or disbelief. But he understood. The game had changed. In the minutes that followed, Janelle was invited to present the full restructuring plan. She didn't look at notes. Every number, chart, and example flowed with calm confidence, as though she had lived with this plan for years. And she had. She had started preparing the day she first read Vantage Corps' annual report in a public library in Detroit, where her father's name appeared only as a footnote. No one knew she had studied everything, from corporate finance to organizational psychology. She didn't explain herself. She proved herself, through presence, precision, and undeniable truth. She didn't talk about her own story. She didn't mention being mistaken for a janitor at financial conferences or studying in laundromats during freezing Harvard nights because dorms closed early. She talked only about the company, the one she believed her father wouldn't recognize if he were still alive. When she finished, the room fell silent. But it wasn't the silence of habit. It was the silence of realization. The realization that they had just heard something real. The interim CEO closed his notebook, looked down, then up. I propose we call an emergency shareholders meeting, and Ms. Thomas will be the first to present. Janelle nodded. No smile, no triumph, just steady, unshakable eyes. Wolf stood, left his binder on the table, and walked out of the room without a word. He didn't wait for consensus. He knew the rules had changed, not because he lost, but because the woman he once sent for coffee was now rewriting the rulebook with a power he couldn't deny, legitimacy and relentless preparation. That day, the internal meeting recording became one of the longest archived sessions in Vantage Corps' history, not for its strategy, but for its symbolism. The woman with no name, the one nobody noticed, had walked in and made the entire system go quiet to listen. She didn't apologize for interrupting. She didn't explain her previous silence. Because when the time is right, you're not just a shareholder. You are the voice they didn't expect. And because they didn't expect it, they never built walls against it. In the days that followed, Janelle began her official role on the board of directors. But she didn't change offices. She continued working on the general floor, still ate lunch with junior staff, and still signed documents with an old blue ink pen, just like her father had. The door to her modest office didn't say vice president. It bore a single quote: "Everyone can be right. The question is, who stops to listen?" That spring, Vantage Corps launched a pilot program called Echo, a space where any employee could record a moment when they felt unheard, an idea that never found airtime, or simply the emotion of a workday. Each recording was archived, encrypted, and played in the listening room, a quiet space nestled within the loudest financial floor. No one was required to go, but slowly it became a place where people who once felt invisible found each other. Janelle never eavesdropped, but once a month she'd sit in that room during lunch break. No speaking, no note-taking, just listening, as anyone else would. One afternoon, a recording played, a receptionist's voice describing the time she was scolded for not looking elegant enough to greet VIP guests. Janelle quietly cried. That same evening, she walked with the front desk manager to personally apologize to the young woman, not for optics, but because she understood what it felt like to be the background in someone else's power painting. Those who once opposed Janelle didn't change because she proved she was better. They changed because they saw themselves more clearly through her leadership. When a senior director retired, he left a note on his desk. "I came for power. I leave because I learned silence." At year-end, during the annual review, someone asked Janelle what she wanted to keep, among all the things she'd changed. She said simply, I want to preserve the things no one sees, because sometimes the quietest foundations are the strongest. The wooden plaque on her office, "Everyone can be right," was eventually copied into small versions, placed on every floor, in every meeting room, every front desk. Not by mandate, but by request. Janelle Thomas never needed to pound the table. Because when you are the voice no one expected, and you choose to speak anyway, you don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to make people want to go silent to hear you fully. And in that way, she didn't just reclaim the seat they thought she didn't deserve. She remade the table, invited more to sit, and always left one chair empty for whoever comes next. The boardroom on the 31st floor of Vantage Core, usually filled with nothing but the tapping of pens on glass tables and the cautious clearing of throats, felt today like a courtroom. No one sat comfortably. No one dared look away from the digital voting panel at the end of the room. The words "Motion to elect interim CEO, vote now," blinked in clean, cold font, like a verdict no one could escape. Janelle stood on the right side of the room, her hand resting on a black clip folder. She said nothing more. She had already presented everything: data, forecasts, a 5-year roadmap, and a digital transformation strategy leveraging AI and financial consulting. She had introduced an integrated ESG model that covered everything from investment frameworks to internal operations. Every person in the room had a copy. There was nothing left to add, and no one dared pretend anymore that her proposal was just a naive pitch from some assistant. No one asked for coffee. No one commented about her being in the wrong place. Derek Wolfe was the first to stand. He adjusted his tie, straightened his back, and turned to face the room. "I object," he said firmly, without hesitation. "She may be smart. She may have degrees. She may own shares. But none of that turns inexperience into leadership. We're not talking about running a bookstore here. This is Vantage Core, a system, a structure, a legacy." He took a few steps, casting a glance at Janelle. "You're young, and sadly still believe good ideas on paper can run a company." Eleanor Grant, head of internal legal affairs, raised an eyebrow. "Derek, she owns 42% of the company. She doesn't need our approval to be on the executive board. The real question is, do we want a CEO who sees what we've refused to face? Or do we double down on a system that's already fracturing?" Derek didn't respond. He turned away, but his eyes no longer held their previous confidence. At that moment, Ramon Patel, the CFO, opened the folder in his hands. "Ms. Thomas didn't just present a vision. She's outlined every component required to implement it. And I have to say, in 27 years of finance, I've never seen a plan with such precision across every projected variable." The room fell still. Janelle remained silent. She knew this wasn't the moment to speak again. The people who once doubted her now had to decide if they had the courage to acknowledge the truth. A soft beep rang out. The voting had begun. On the screen, each board member's name appeared. One executive nodded. "Approve." Another. "Approve." And another. "Approve." Then came Derek's turn. He looked at the reject button in front of him, then over at Janelle. Finally, he pressed it. Reject. No one in the room was surprised. The screen showed 8-1. Janelle Thomas was officially appointed interim CEO, pending confirmation at the shareholder meeting at the end of the quarter. But everyone understood. This vote wasn't just internal procedure. It was a declaration. An era had ended, and a new chapter had begun, led by a black woman who once was asked to fetch coffee. Janelle stayed until nearly 2 a.m. She didn't go home right away. Instead, she descended to the ground floor, where a wall once proudly displayed portraits of the company's founders. There was a photo of Jerome Ackerman, her father, smiling calmly beside another man, Douglas Vance. But nowhere was there a trace of her. No record that she had ever belonged here. Until now. She quietly pulled a small photo from her coat pocket, a picture of her mother, Monica Thomas, mopping the floor of a nursing home, her eyes glowing with quiet belief. Janelle placed it gently inside the corner of the memorial cabinet, where no one would notice, so that every day she would remember exactly where she came from and for whom she continued. This wasn't revenge, it was return, not to tear down, but to rebuild what had once been denied. And the first thing she typed in her company-wide email at 6:12 the next morning was just one line: History isn't written by those with the most power. It's written by those no longer afraid to speak. Her first morning as interim CEO of Vantage Corp was not a victory lap decorated with flowers and champagne. It was surgery, no anesthesia, no delay. At exactly 8:15 a.m., Janelle walked into her temporary office, still no nameplate on the door, and requested an urgent meeting with HR, legal, and internal communications. What we're about to do must be done by the book, cleanly, legally, and without fallout, but it needs to be finished by 3 p.m. The head of HR blinked. You mean? Janelle looked directly at her. Derek Wolfe, Karina Doyle, Marcus Fielding. They will no longer be part of this organization as of today. The room fell silent, not from surprise, but because no one had ever dared do it. Wolfe had been rooted in this system for over 25 years. Karina, the head of HR, was known for once saying, "We're not exclusionary. Some people just don't fit the Vantage culture." And Marcus, the COO, was infamous for sarcastic remarks toward employees of color and had 3 unresolved complaints filed against him, none ever addressed. "Is there an official reason?" the general counsel asked. Janelle opened a folder and turned to the first page. "I've compiled sufficient evidence, emails, HR complaints, and anonymous staff recordings, grounds for termination, professional misconduct, abuse of authority, and undermining a diverse workplace culture." She paused. "But I'm not doing this for revenge. Someone has to be the one to clean the platform if we want this train to move forward." At 11:07 a.m., Derek Wolfe was invited into a private meeting. Legal, HR, and internal comms were already seated. On the table, his termination papers. Still rattled from yesterday's vote, Wolfe entered with his usual swagger. "Who called me in here?" "I did," Janelle said, stepping in from the adjacent room, contract in hand. "Sit down, Mr. Wolfe." No coffee this time. No smirk. He didn't sit. "This is a joke, right? Who the hell do you think you are?" Janelle didn't answer. She gave a nod to the HR lead, who began reading the terms. Wolfe had no choice but to listen. His face reddened. His eyes flicked between outrage and disbelief. But when he reached the line that read, 42% equity held by Janelle Thomas under Ackerman Trust Clause, he stopped arguing. He signed and walked out, quieter than he had ever left a boardroom in his entire career. Elsewhere in the building, Karina Doyle and Marcus Fielding received meeting invitations to separate rooms. When they walked in, they saw serious faces, documents already placed on the table, and no smiles. Within 30 minutes, both exited the Vantage Corp headquarters, one cursing into a phone, the other quietly tearing their ID badge and dropping it into the main lobby trash bin. But that was only the surface. Janelle's reform wasn't just about cutting. It marked the beginning of a deeper graft. She asked HR to retrieve a list of candidates previously rejected for poor culture fit. The names included community college graduates, nonprofit workers, and applicants from the city's underserved districts. Janelle personally sent invitations to reapply. Some cried. Some asked 3 times to make sure the email wasn't a mistake. At one of the first onboarding sessions, instead of launching with the usual company slideshow, Janelle opened with a simple message. "We didn't bring you here to fit in. We brought you here to make this place better, different, and more right." She also founded the Monica Fund, named after her mother, a scholarship for Black students pursuing careers in finance and business. Every year, the fund would award 20 full-ride scholarships, prioritizing applicants from under-resourced areas, public schools, or first-generation college students. But she didn't stop there. She expanded the initiative into a startup support program called Rooted Rise, an early-stage venture capital fund financed by Vantage but not governed by it, ensuring community-led decision-making. The first company-wide campaign she launched was called Vantage for All. The new emblem, a compass with no set direction, a message that there shouldn't be only one path to success. The old slogan, Vantage.com, for performance, was officially replaced by Vantage for People, for progress. In the main lobby, once lined with revenue leaderboards, a new glass wall appeared, etched with dozens of employee stories. A single mother in IT. A former homeless man who now led a project team. Internally, reactions were mixed at first. Some long-timers whispered in the hallway about politicized awakening. But for the younger staff, especially those who had long felt sidelined. Janelle became a living symbol of something they never thought was real, a leader who didn't need to shout, but still made the entire system shift. On a dreary Tuesday morning in mid-October, as Chicago slid into the early grip of cold winds, the Vantage Corps headquarters felt unusually quiet. No company-wide memos, no strategic meetings, just another workday like any other. But on the 27th floor, inside the CEO's executive office, something not so ordinary had just occurred. The door opened. Janelle looked up from her computer screen and saw Derek Wolfe standing there. No briefcase, no laptop, just himself. A smaller, diminished version of the presence that had once loomed large over the company for 2 decades. "Good morning," he said hesitantly. Janelle didn't get up. She simply gestured toward the chair across from her, the same one he had sat in hundreds of times as a leader. This time, there was no assistant bringing him coffee, no slides ready to present, just a silent room with two people once on opposite ends of the system, now facing each other. No titles, no power, only who they really were. "I didn't come to argue," Derek began. "I just wanted to apologize." Janelle looked at him without blinking, her expression oddly calm. No tension, no sarcasm, no triumph. "I think," Derek continued, his voice hoarse, whether from emotion or shame, long delayed, it wasn't clear. "I was wrong. About a lot of things. Not just with you, but with the people I once thought didn't belong." Janelle didn't respond immediately. She leaned slightly forward, her hands folded on the desk. On it sat a familiar white ceramic mug, the same one she had set down in the boardroom on her first day when Derek told her to fetch the coffee. "You know, Derek," she said slowly, "when you handed me that cup, I didn't feel angry. I just saw clearly. This entire system was built on the assumption that someone like me would never sit in this chair." She paused, lifted the cup slightly, turning it slowly in her hands as if weighing a memory. "And I didn't argue. I didn't blame you either. I just knew what I needed to do to change it." Derek nodded. He didn't defend himself. He didn't ask for forgiveness. Perhaps because he knew. Years of quiet decisions had left scars no apology could immediately heal. "But still," he said softly, "I hope you do better than I did." Janelle smiled faintly. "I'll try, Derek, but not alone, and not the old way." The conversation ended without a handshake, just a nod. Derek stood up and quietly walked away. The door closed behind him. Janelle stayed seated for a while, staring out the window. Below her, the skyline of Detroit, the city she had once left behind with a promise to her mother. "One day I'll walk into a building where people rise to greet you." She hadn't just walked in. She had stood tall and pulled the system up with her. That afternoon, as the sun dipped behind mirrored towers, Janelle left her office without calling for a car. She walked floor by floor, hallway by hallway. To everyone she passed, she greeted them by name. "Good afternoon, Mario," she said to the security guard at the ground floor. "Hello, Miss Doris. Your hair looks lovely today." She smiled at the senior assistant in legal. "Nina, last month's project was incredible," she told a young designer working in the open space studio. And when she stepped through the main revolving door, the white coffee cup was still in her hand. Not to drink, but to remember every great change begins with a small act, and sometimes the smallest slight can spark a quiet but enduring revolution. Some revolutions don't start with gunfire. They start with a cup of coffee. Some people don't need to raise their voices to be heard. They just need to stand their ground. In a room where no one sees them, they walk in anyway and change everything. Janelle's story isn't a fairy tale. It's a reminder: never judge someone by the clothes they wear. Never forget to ask the name of the janitor at the end of the hallway. And never underestimate the person quietly pouring your coffee, because tomorrow they might be signing your paycheck. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or felt invisible in a room full of bright lights, remember, your silence holds power too. And sometimes that power is enough to rewrite an entire system. If this story moved you, if it made you rethink the way we treat one another, leave a comment. We read every single one, and we value every word. Share with us. Have you ever been someone like Janelle? Or have you ever met a Janelle in your life? Tell us your story. And if you believe that dignity should always come before titles, hit that subscribe button so you won't miss stories that touch the deepest part of us all: justice, kindness, and truth. Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes a single coffee cup can change an entire corporation.